Welcome to video 3. Hopefully, the last video, if it goes a little bit over 37 minutes, that's okay. So, the United States is now officially in this war against Germany and its allies on the side of Great Britain and France and powerhouse Italy. So, before we talk about the last year of the war, I want to talk about how we got ready for this. So, there's a lot of things you kind of got to figure out when you're turning over to war production. We're kind of seeing this with this COVID-19, how you have that you have that law that says you can force companies to make things for national security. That's the kind of thing we had to figure out. So many progressives actually wanted Woodrow Wilson to use the opportunity to rein in big business. Wilson was afraid that big business would become even more powerful. He was able to increase wages and give federal protection to unions through government contracts. Unfortunately, these will not be permanent for workers. In the winter of 1917, the railroad system was paralyzed. Problems with blizzards, fuel shortages, and poor coordination between railroads really hurt. Private companies really hurt the industry. This prevented the delivery of war related freight, and that was a problem. There was also labor unrest. Many skilled railroad workers had left for higher paying factory jobs because that was one of the things that happened with the new government contracts is you had unskilled laborers getting paid more than some of these skilled workers. The railway union actually prepared to go on strike. The federal government came in, took over the management of the railroad companies for the rest of the war. The railroad administration gave workers higher wages, standardized equipment, and coordinated the use of the tracks. The big problem here is they didn't take care of the tracks and they were basically decimated after the war, and I'm honestly not sure the railroads have ever recovered. We also created the War Industry Board, the WIB, um, basically to prioritize industries to make sure that those needed for the war effort, those companies that were needed for the war effort, received the needed raw materials. We paid railroad companies for the use of their railroads, so those fat cats were pretty happy. Um, as I mentioned, the wartime use of the railroads really hurt the system. Herbert Hoover was placed in charge. He became the Food Administration Director. He used high prices and patriotic appeals to make sure there was enough food to go around. He'll also help feed Europe after the war. He organized propaganda campaigns to conserve food, meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, things like that, victory gardens, things like that. Um, both business and labor did very well during the war, but after the war, things will go back to the status quo. In fact, they'll actually go back to a pre-progressive era status quo. Uh, 5,000 African Americans during this time will migrate from the south to the north looking for work. There were fear of racial riots. Women during this time also fight for the right to vote, leading to the 19th Amendment. Final state to vote on that was Tennessee, passed by one vote. We talked about that before. In 1917, the government passed the Espionage Act that said you cannot obstruct military recruitment in places like college campuses. In 1918, we passed the Sedition Act that said no disloyal language would be tolerated. Now, you might think, well, if you remember back to John Adams and his Sedition Act, that didn't go over very well. This seems like a violation of the First Amendment. Well, the Supreme Court actually upheld this law. And they used a phrase that I'm sure you've heard before, clear and present danger. Basically, they said that in a time of crisis, the government could curtail free speech. This is also where you get that saying you're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater if it's not on fire. That's where that saying comes from as well. So that's not great. Some German Americans were attacked, some were even tarred and feathered. To raise an army, Wilson went with conscription. Who that way, if you had everyone in a draft, you could determine who should go over to war, who should stay at home and work in factories and things like that. He called the draft selective services. The idea was that all men had to register on one day, June 5th, 1917. If you've ever seen the movie Sergeant York, which I recommend, that's part of that story where Sergeant York learns that he has to sign up for the draft, but he doesn't want to because he had given up his Hellion ways and become a born again Christian, didn't want to kill people until he read an American civics book in that movie and said, America is worth killing for. So, 3 million men refused to sign up for selective services, which, by the way, men at the age of 18 now have to do that still. It could actually mess up your financial aid if you don't. Many of them went to jail, some went to Canada, other places. Now, there was one thing: you could be a conscientious objector. That meant that if you were a follower of a pacifist religion, then you could get out of fighting in the war. Alvin York, as I mentioned before, is probably the most famous conscientious objector, and he went on to fight anyway. In fact, 80% of other conscientious objectors who were drafted went on to fight in the war. Conscripts will become 72% of the Army. This is 20% of draft age males that served in the military, 15% of our total male population. We had to quickly create training camps from scratch all over the country. In fact, we didn't have enough guns at first. You know, those marching band rifles, they had to drill with those in some places. 18% of the Army, about 1 in 5, were foreign born. 12,000 Native Americans served, 25% of that group. 16,000 women went as nurses, telephone workers, and other support positions. African Americans made up 13% of the military, while being 10% of the population. The Army was segregated. 89% of African Americans were used as labor troops under white officers, building roads and bridges. They did, as I mentioned before, find a more racially tolerant atmosphere in France, and this led to a fear of some post-war race riots, and some African American veterans did join civil rights groups after the war. The government brought in psychologists to administer intelligence tests to assign people to the right jobs in the military. This wasn't a great thing. 25% of those who were conscripted had to take the test for illiterates. And the tests were flawed. Basically, the test said, and they broke it down by racial group, whites had a mental age of 13, Russians had a middle age of 11.34, Italians 11.01, the Polish 10.74, and African Americans 10.41. Now, what this actually showed was your level of education. So it wasn't really a true intelligence test. And basically, it'll be used to kind of further the notion of white supremacy in a lot of ways. So that's how the United States prepared for the war. Now, let's talk about the last year of the war. Germany was very hopeful of a victory after the Russian withdrawal. Germany decided on one last gamble, a big offensive in the West to break the stalemate. The offense started in March and will last until July. They will advance 40 miles to the Marne River, getting within 35 miles of Paris. So basically, they get back to where they were at the beginning of the war. At that point, an Allied counterattack supported by 140,000 new American fighters under John J. Jack Black Pershing was able to defeat the Germans at the Second Battle of the Marne. Germany then used up its reserve. Ludendorff knew, and by this point, Paul von Hindenburg and Ludendorff are in charge of the entire German war effort. Ludendorff knew that the war was lost, especially when another million Americans got there. Allied forces began moving toward Germany. On September 28, 1918, Ludendorff informed the government that the war was lost and demanded that they sue for peace at once, so the defeat was not the Army's. Allies, however, because of the American 14 points, basically uh, said that they would not make peace with an autocratic government. So what the Germans had to do is they had to depose Wilhelm II. They set up a liberal government who promptly surrendered. That was called the Weimar Republic. This is going to cause major problems in the 1920s. We'll get to that, but what I want you to think about is this. How would you feel as if you were in Germany where there really wasn't a whole lot of fighting taking place? You were being told every day by your government that you are winning the war, you're winning, you're winning, you're winning. Next thing you know, your king, your Kaiser, has left the building. He has left the country, gone into exile, and there's a new government, and the first thing it does is promptly surrender. How do you feel? Keep that in mind. So, uh, the November 9th, the German Republic was proclaimed. On November 11th, 1918, an armistice was signed to end the war. The war was over, but revolutionary fervor will still be present. Now, I want to talk about casualties, and I'm going to give you some broad numbers, and then I'm going to talk about some specific American numbers. And really, there's so much more to the war. If you're really interested in the war, use it as a paper topic. There's classes that are all about it. There are so many things I'm really leaving out here. So here's what happened. 8 to 9 million people died in battle. 22 million were wounded. Later, many died of their injuries. Many lost limbs. Birth rates declined. The death of so many led to a lost generation. If that was not bad enough, you had a pandemic during that time that was actually called the Spanish flu. Now, this has been something that's been on a lot of our minds lately. You probably have even heard people mention the Spanish flu pandemic. And it's an example of racism. The Spanish flu did not start in Spain. The Spanish flu started in Kansas. It was taken to Europe, where American servicemen, when they deployed, they took it to Europe. It spread out. The reason it was called the Spanish flu is because Spain was a neutral nation, and they were really the only ones who were being honest about death rates and things like that. So they soon became known as the Spanish flu. The Spanish government did not like that, by the way. And so it really should have been called the Kansas flu. It will kill 30 million people worldwide. People like Woodrow Wilson will actually come down with the flu, and he will become extremely ill. So you lose 8 to 9 million people in the war. You lose a lot of other people who are wounded, and then 30 million people die of the flu in what was one of the worst pandemics in world history. No wonder there's a lost generation. We're going to see how they cope with that in the 1920s. Veterans were accustomed to violence. Many civilians died from war, civil war, and starvation. In 1915, the Ottomans rose up against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans killed the Armenian men, expelling the women and children. 600,000 Armenians were killed. 500,000 were deported. 400,000 of those died during the march through the deserts and swamps of Syria and Iraq. By September of 1915, 1 million Armenians were dead in a genocide. Turkey does not take responsibility for that even to this day. We're also going to see a lot of revolutionary upheavals throughout the country. Now, I wanted to give you some specific numbers. So, from the flu, 25 million Americans got sick. Remember, 30 million died worldwide. 675,000 Americans died from the flu. 1 million soldiers were sick. Um, as I mentioned, after it ran its course in 1919, 30 million had died worldwide. Now, I want to tell you, November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m., the armistice is a day we still celebrate. It used to be Armistice Day. In Canada, it's Remembrance Day. Here it is Veterans Day. Here are some more specific numbers. 1.3 million French died, 722,000 British. The Germans lost 1.8 million, and Americans lost 116,516 soldiers. More Americans will die here than in Vietnam and Korea. So that's the war. If you got questions about it, make sure you ask me on the video or on the discussion board, and I'll answer your question. What I want to conclude with today is I want to talk about the peace settlement in Paris. There's a wonderful book called Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan that really gets into it a whole lot more than we can. If you'd like diplomatic history, I highly recommend it. It's a very weird peace conference. First of all, Woodrow Wilson decides to go and represent the United States himself. The big problem is we had divided government. He didn't take any Republicans with him. That's going to cost him after the conference. This was very weird because, well, Teddy Roosevelt had become the first president to leave the country, and he had only gone to South America, same time zones. And now you got Woodrow Wilson leaving for Paris. So we weren't really sure how that was going to work. The other big problem with that is, when negotiating, one stalling tactic is sometimes, I don't know. I've got to talk to the president. Well, when he's down the table, that doesn't do you any good. And so Woodrow Wilson decides to go. The aims of the war had changed over time from gaining territory to more idealistic principles. Woodrow Wilson wanted to bring greater stability to the world. He submitted to Congress his 14 points that would justify the war effort, steps for lasting peace, including open covenants of peace openly arrived at, whatever that means, reduction of armaments, basically that meant actually no secret treaties. Russia had embarrassed the Allies by releasing all their secret treaties after the war, or during the war, really. They said he wanted self-determination of all groups. He said the war was waged against absolutism and militarism. And most importantly, he wanted to create a League of Nations to guarantee the integrity of small nations. Wilson was cheered in Europe. Other nations were not as idealistic. They wanted to follow the treaties that they had signed before the war. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, had won a large electoral victory, promising to make Germany pay. The French President, Georges Clemenceau, was concerned about national security and revenge. Clemenceau wanted a demilitarized Germany, large German reparations, a separate Rhineland as a buffer. Wilson saw this as vindictive. But the big elephant in the room was Russia and the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. What they will do is they'll actually enlarge Eastern European countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania to act as a barrier, taking land from Russia and Germany. Big does not mean powerful. There were 27 nations at the negotiations. They did not invite Germany, Austria, any of the losing powers, or Russia. It will be dominated by the big three, Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George. Sometimes your book might refer to the big four, Orlando of Italy. He was more of a nuisance than anything else. Wilson wanted the League of Nations to prevent war. Clemenceau and Lloyd George wanted to punish Germany. Finally, there was a compromise. On January 25th, 1919, they adopted the principles of the League of Nations, details to be determined later. Wilson, for his part, made compromises on territorial agreements. Clemenceau gave up on the notion of an independent Rhineland and accepted defensive alliances with Great Britain and the United States. We promised to support France if they were attacked. So, what was odd about this? And It was such a to-do. I really do recommend Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. There's a lot of back and forth. Japan was there. We voted down. They wanted a clause about racial equality. We voted it down. We tried to get in a provision about gender equality. They forced it to be voted down. It was a lot of interesting back and forth. But what was odd is normally when you fight a war, everybody comes together, the winners and the losers, and you hammer out a treaty. Well, that's not what happened here. The winners came together. They created what was called the Treaty of Versailles. There's actually 5 separate treaties for the defeated nations of Austria, Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. And basically, they brought them in and they said, this is it. Sign it or we invade your country. Germany was very unhappy. They came and said, how can you treat us like this? We would never treat anyone like this, though they just had done it to the Russians, but I guess that didn't count. They were very unhappy with Article 231, which was the war guilt clause, which said Germany and Austria, it was in Austria's treaty too, were responsible for starting the war. They will sign on June 28th, 1919. Germany was ordered to pay reparations. Amount would be determined later. In April 1921, it was determined to be 132 billion marks. That's about $33 billion. They were going to have to pay 2.5 billion marks paid in gold marks each year. We'll see how well that worked. Not well. Germany had to reduce its army to 100,000, cut back its navy, and eliminate its air force. They lost Alsace and Lorraine to France and parts of Prussia to Poland. The land west and 30 miles east of the Rhine became a demilitarized zone, stripped of armaments and fortifications. The new German government reluctantly accepted the dictated treaty. So there we are. Other treaties redrew the map of Eastern Europe. Germany and Russia lost a lot of territory. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire disappeared. You can actually call World War I the war to end empires. In its place, you saw countries like Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary. The Balkans were restructured territorially. Romania got land from Russia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Serbia became the center of Yugoslavia. They found that they could not draw lines based on ethnic groups in Eastern Europe. So a lot of countries end up with large ethnic minorities. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered, but under the League of Nations, they had this idea of mandates. We weren't supposed to have colonies anymore. So the idea is they put countries in 3 different categories of mandates. We'll call it A, B, and C. A was they were almost ready to rule themselves. B was they needed a little bit of work. C was they were fairly hopeless. Another example of racism is you basically skin tone got darker as you went A to C. We dismembered the Ottoman Empire. We recognized Arab states in the Middle East. France took control of Libya and Syria, while the British took Palestine and Iraq. They will eventually get their independence. When Iraq got their independence, the first thing they did is basically got rid of everyone who had worked with the British. These mandates were officially administered territories on behalf of the League of Nations. We even had a mandate at one point. Now, we signed this treaty. Wilson's happy. He comes back to the United States. The Republicans control the Senate. Remember, for a treaty, you need 2/3 of a vote. Congress rejected the defensive alliance with France, so Britain backed out at the same time. And eventually, Wilson was going to go on a barnstorming tour of the country to sell this treaty, but he suffered a debilitating stroke. It's possible his wife kind of ran the country for the last of his term. The treaty is voted down with a joint resolution of Congress. They declared that the war was ended. Each state also did that. I was reading not too long ago that Mississippi officially ended World War One in the 1990s, so that was weird. So when a German admiral saw this treaty, he said this was not a peace treaty. This was a 20 years armistice, and he's going to be proven to be right. Uh, all of this is going to turn out to be a mistake. We're going to see that when we begin to talk about the 1920s and the build up to the war. I hope that these videos have been informative. Try to kind of keep them short. Please, if you do have questions, make sure you ask me. Our take home final, by the way, our final will be like, you know, how you have essay questions on the midterm. It's going to be all the essay questions, but you're going to answer two of them. So, so this will definitely be one of the topics. I look forward to reading your comments on the discussion board. I wish you all well. Next week, we're gonna watch. I'm gonna have you watch that movie and do the 2-page typed movie critique. Remember on that, what you do is brief summary of the movie. We've all seen it. And then you're going to talk about how historically accurate it is, what's right, what's wrong. I'm also going to post an article that, you know, from the time period. And the following week, when I talk about the 1920s, I'll give you even more information then. The actual critique won't be due until the end of the semester because I want to give you guys time to work on everything you need to do. So until next time, I hope you have a pleasant week.